We've all been on the receiving end of an apology that somehow leaves us feeling worse. The person says the words "I'm sorry," but the tone is completely flat. Their body language is heavily defensive, and most importantly, their behavior never actually changes. When relationship counselors evaluate whether an apology is actually genuine, they listen closely for one specific, highly destructive word: the word "but." It usually sounds something like, "I'm sorry I did this, but you did that." Psychologists call this the ownership bypass. Instead of taking full responsibility, they attempt a transactional exchange, shifting the blame to justify themselves. This conditional apology signals a self-serving psychological defense mechanism, prioritizing the offender's ego over actual restoration. In both clinical and theological circles, this defensive posture has a name: attrition. It is essentially false repentance. This diagram illustrates the loop of attrition. The attrition is driven entirely by a fear of consequences and a heavy dose of self-pity. It is the psychological equivalent of a child caught with their hand in the cookie jar crying, "I'm sorry, please don't spank me." The person in this cycle is not grieving the damage they caused. They operate on false guilt, an intense desire to protect themselves and escape their own personal discomfort. They just want the embarrassment or the argument to stop. Because attrition is just an escape hatch to avoid pain, the internal desires of the person never shift. As soon as the immediate threat of punishment passes, the destructive behavior is guaranteed to return. Breaking this cycle and actually healing a relational rupture requires a complete psychological and spiritual inversion. It requires moving from attrition to contrition. The theologian A.W. Tozer called this the wound of contrition. We often treat repentance like a simple intellectual change of mind, a quick decision to do better. True contrition, however, acts like a physical wound that fractures the proud human ego. When the reality of our actions finally strikes us, it defeats that self-assured defensive posture. The focus shifts away from our own inconvenience and onto the deep damage we cause the people around us, and ultimately to God. Without this internal shattering and surrender of pride, lasting outward behavioral change is impossible. When a contrite heart translates into real-world action, it alters how a person navigates conflict. All sense of entitlement vanishes. Instead of arguing over the exact historical facts of an event to minimize their guilt, a contrite person leans in. They validate the impact of the pain they caused, inviting the injured party to share their experience. They also commit to a principle counselors call rip and repair. They understand that an apology is a call to action, not a tool used to quickly end an argument. They explicitly ask, "How can I repair this with you?" and outline how they plan to behave differently. They know this process takes time. A contrite person anticipates the wounded person's hesitation. They endure early distrust without getting defensive, knowing they must rebuild trust through believable behavior. They do not demand immediate forgiveness. They are simply humbled and deeply grateful that the other person is willing to give them a second chance. When we recognize the depth of the damage we've done to another person, the contrite heart begins to see a vertical dimension to the failure. Like King David in the wake of his own betrayals, the offender realizes that every relational rupture is a defiance of God's laws. Isaiah 57:15 describes God's specific proximity to this state of mind. He is not repelled by spiritual bankruptcy. He is drawn to it. Think about how a human heart melts when a loved one approaches us in weakness, admitting their faults. God's heart responds exactly the same way to our raw, unvarnished confession. A contrite heart provides an immediate exit ramp out of the downward cycle of toxic shame. Instead of hiding, we go vertical, stepping directly into divine grace. But for many people trying to change, this introduces a paralyzing new anxiety. We look inward and worry that we don't feel sorry enough, that our repentance is too shallow to be valid. This animation illustrates the danger of that thinking. When we try to weigh our tears to see if we've earned forgiveness, we fall into a terrible trap. We can never stack up enough personal sorrow to balance the scale. Manufacturing the perfect amount of agony turns repentance into legalistic work. It is an attempt to impress God with our inner misery, which is actually a subtle form of self-righteous pride. Relying on the depth of our despair as a claim for forgiveness turns the liberating message of the gospel into a heavy yoke of bondage. There is a clinical insight that shatters this trap. The cross covers both the visible trespass and the internal hardness that makes it difficult to feel genuine sorrow. God accepts our sincere, albeit imperfect, repentance because His forgiveness is anchored in His free grace. It is not conditioned on a flawless display of penitent emotion. And here is the final irony. It is only when we completely stop trying to manufacture the perfect amount of grief through self-punishment that our defenses finally drop. Resting in that free grace is the exact thing that melts the heart, finally producing the genuine contrition